Hi. When I was a child, once in a blue moon, my mother would take down from the top shelf of her wardrobe a battered black box. This shelf was always enticing to me, jammed as it was with tins of snapshots, shoeboxes of letters, and, best of all, my mother's old nursing texts. These were hefty tomes from the 1950s, their hard, plain covers giving no hint of the freak show inside. Here were ulcerated legs, clubbed fingers, aorta sprouting something called vegetation. The midwifery text was heart-stopping. Inside were garish placentas slopping in pans, and shrivelled infants, multi-headed infants, infants labelled cretin. I would pore over these books, and then I'd look at her, this woman who was my ordinary mother, yet was also somehow connected to these horrors. I struggled to make sense of her past of love letters and misshapen limbs, couldn't reconcile it to her life with us in Box Hill, the weatherboard house, the endless stream of offspring. The contents of the black box only enhanced the mystery of who she was. Indeed, inside the box lurked the most disquieting aspect of all. Inside was a slide projector. Occasionally, when the mood took her, Mum would close off the hallway, assemble the projector, and focus its one beam on the toilet door. She had travelled alone through Europe in her 20s, something which was relatively unusual for a young woman in the early 60s to do. Out of the dimness would shine images of a youthful version of her, lean and jazzy in cream pants and sleeveless shirts, against the backdrop of a world we could only trust had been true. 1964 Europe, as projected on the toilet door, was a place of pink stone and blue sky, a clean, calm place, soft at the edges. I remember no crowds, just a few upright pedestrians, and occasionally some curiously shaped cars. Posed in the centre of each scene would be our mother, atop the Eiffel Tower, feeding pigeons in St Mark's, smiling beneath a London billboard advertising a hard day's night. Hunkered in the hall, we would see through her memory in the eye of her camera the Arc de Triomphe, the bullfight, the farmhouse of our dire Irish relatives. We'd thrill to the tale of the Egyptian cameleer who wouldn't let her off the camel until she'd paid more money. But we were always waiting for one slide in particular, a bay of sapphire water, a curve of bleached stone. Greece, a country forever coloured in my mind by the crime my mother committed there. Tell the story, we would beg, and she'd evade a moment, then tell it again. Something, heat or boredom or maybe a traveller's loneliness, possessed her to go to the movies one night in Athens. Even as a child, I thought this foolhardy. Anything could happen to a lone young lady at night, and that night, to my mother, something did. Not long after the movie started, a man settled into the seat beside her. For a time he behaved himself, quietly watching the film. Then, inevitably, his hand began to creep. It crept out of his lap and onto my mother's thigh. Once there, it commenced to stroke seductively. "What did you do?" we goggle-eyed kids would ask more than a decade later. Our mother's reply was always the same. Rather than shift to another seat, she'd reached to her hat, removed the 3-inch-long pin from its brim, and, in one swift and surgically precise movement, driven it into the gentleman's leg. We children would reel. Our mum had stabbed someone. We had a mother who had stabbed someone. I could never decide how I felt about this. On the one hand, I was impressed. On the other, it was unnerving to be in the dark with such a woman. If she could stab a Greek man as naturally as plucking a flower, what could she do to us, we horde who drove her mad? "What happened?" we'd ask. "What happened after you stabbed him?" Apparently, he'd merely risen from his seat and limped off without a word. "Without a word?" we'd splutter. "Without a word," Mum confirmed. "Limped off to die," proposed my sister. "He should have kept his hands to himself," said Mum. I loved that story. It settled deep in my mind alongside aortic vegetation. Looking at my placid mother, I understood that the world has many faces and is not always what it seems. When I told her I would tell tonight the story of Greece and the hatpin, my 71-year-old mother squawked, "Say it was somebody else, don't say it was me." Then, perhaps remembering who she was, she smiled a kindly old lady's smile and said, He's probably dead now anyway.
I was a young bloke, like a lot of young blokes. I faffed around a bit with the martial arts. Took myself off to a ninja school once, just once. Oh, there's some boys who weren't getting laid, let me tell you. Getting around in their spanky black pyjamas, throwing pretend smoke bombs with the noise. Had to be pretend, because council health and safety regulations didn't allow them to use real smoke bombs in the dojo. And it's probably better, because if you think about it, if the dojo was full of smoke, people would have got hit with the ninja throwing stars, and if they'd been practicing dripping poison into people's mouths down fishing lines, they might not have got the right guy. Did a little bit of judo when I was a kid. My parents sent me to judo because I was kind of a weedy, asthmatic child. They thought maybe it would bulk me up a little bit and help me breathe, and it did help with the breathing, but I was a weedy, asthmatic child and I didn't like being thrown around on the mat, so eventually I threw a tantrum and didn't go anymore. I returned to it in my early 20s, or returned to the dojo in my early 20s. I didn't go back to judo. I started training another martial art, a much older one called jiu-jitsu, which is where judo came from. And I liked it. I liked it a lot more than judo because I was an idiot. The thing about judo, it's a sport. It's very soft. It was developed by a very wise man called Jigoro Kano, who wanted to take the violence and the anger out of society, and so he took it out of the old martial arts. So, you throw somebody in judo, you help them, they're helping you. Like, they hit the mat, it's all nice. You throw somebody in jiu-jitsu, and, their arm is going to break in 3 places on the way down, and then when they hit the ground, the real fun starts. Full of machismo and testosterone and stupidity. That really appealed to me, and it still does, actually. It still appeals to me because, although I'm a little older, more grizzled, I have a 10-year-old daughter that I have recently begun to teach jiu-jitsu. And it's my hope that when Anna leaves home and begins to date in 30 or 40 years, should something go wrong on that date, should some bastard put his hand on her knee, for instance, she will snap that hand off at the wrist, beat him to death with it. Not all martial arts are like this. Some of them are actually very, very gentle. One of the most gentle, one of the most intriguing is a fighting art called Aikido, developed by a man called Ueshiba. He is very, very interested in the idea of harmony. Aikido, there's no actual Japanese word. Aikido means way, and to study the way of something means to sort of attempt to understand the spirit of it. Aiki sort of means harmony or harmonious. It's not a word which is actually used outside the Aikido dojo very much. So Aikido is, the way of studying harmony or the way of studying harmonious spirits. A friend of mine studied it. He was very good. When I knew him, he was Aikido Shohan, he was black belt. He's probably, I haven't seen him for many years, he's probably Shihan now, a master. And those of us who used to do the silly, brutal fighting arts with the pretend smoke bombs and the throwing stars, we were constantly picking on him. Not properly picking on him because he'd destroy us, but we pick on his martial art because it wasn't really tough. And he would laugh at us. He had studied this art for a year in Japan to begin with, and then he'd come back and studied a lot more here. And it had saved his life, which is the story I will actually now get to. But it didn't save it in the way that you would imagine. Like, he didn't beat down 20 dudes who were coming at him, with smoke bombs and throwing stars. He took himself off to Japan because he's kind of a hippie. Not a trad hippie with the big hair and everything. He actually had very nice hair and he wore shoes. But he was into that whole harmony thing, which, so he was in his heart a hippie. He went off to Japan and he studied at the dojo. He didn't live inside, he lived just outside, and he needed to live just outside because it wasn't like studying a martial art here. There'll be a few of you who've done it here. If there's blokes in the audience, probably most of you, have done it at one point or another for a week or two. You'll turn up for an hour or so, and in that hour you'll do a few breakfalls, you'll sort of, roll it around, throw some ninja stars, some pretend smoke bombs, half a dozen things, and then you go home, have some beers. It's not how it happened for Pete in Japan. He would have to come in at about 5 o'clock in the morning and make breakfast for the senior students and the masters, and then clean up the breakfast, and then he would clean up the dojo. He would sort of mop the floors and dust down the tatami, and he worked for about 4 or 5 hours before they got onto the mat. And then when they finally got onto the mat, there was no, smoke bombs or throwing stars. They would do their breakfalls, and they'd do those breakfalls over and over and over and over. Should I keep going? Because they did them for about 4 hours. And not just all the breakfalls, but one. Back breakfall, for instance. There's lots and lots of throws in judo, jiu-jitsu, aikido, where you end up on your back. And if you don't want to smash your head in, you don't want a broken spine, you need to know how to get down there without hurting yourself. When we practice it here, we'll do it for 2 or 3 minutes. These guys did it for 4 hours. They practiced the back breakfall to the point where as they rolled over their shoulders, they did it so many times that the skin and the meat began to abrade from their bodies, and they ended up with massive calloused scabs to the point where they couldn't do that anymore, so they'd have to do something else. Kneeling practice, for instance. You think you know how to kneel? I think you're pretty good at kneeling, hey? Yeah. I know some kneeling moves, mate. But nothing like Pete, because Pete practiced kneeling for hours and hours and hours at a time, to the point where all of the flesh came off his kneecaps, and they would start each day in the dojo with the sound of their knees cracking open as they got down to do some more kneeling practice. This went on and on for weeks and then months, and eventually they began to do some technique. He was there for a long time, and he learned a lot of technique. Not all of it was physical. One of the things he had to learn was a sort of weird state of mind. And all of that punishment, all of that diabolical pain and self-abnegation was part of that learning process. He had to sort of break down the subject-object division between mind and body, and he had to understand that in this art, the mind and the body are the same thing, and eventually you hopefully get to a point where actually the description of it is mind, no mind. You are there, you are conscious, but you're sort of not. It's kind of like the Force in Star Wars or something. So he's done this for about a year, and, being a hippie, it's time to move on. He actually had one of those tickets, you just sort of take it around the world. He was supposed to go to London, and he wanted to go via India, hippie. He does a couple of days there, and eats some leaves and twig, it's time to move on. He ends up in a regional airport, and it's chaos. It's chaos and madness in the way that only Indian regional airports can do chaos and madness. Doesn't bother Pete. This is a guy who has spent so long on his knees the last year or so, the skin has worn off them. So he just gets himself into his mind, no mind frame of mind, and he just sits there surrounded by the chaos. It is just swelling, and it just goes on. It goes on not for days, but he was there for at least 9 or 10 hours, he told us, trying to maintain this state of mind, no mind. There were families complaining, there were kids going off. Anybody who's been trapped in an airport with kids for more than a couple of hours will know what it was like. Pete's just letting it wash over him. mind, no mind. And then a man came walking through. He was some kind of official. It was nothing other than, a clipboard which told anybody he was an official. But Pete saw this guy. He had no intention of doing anything, but for some reason he suddenly found himself, he was up off the floor where he had been kneeling. He was just projecting himself through the chaos and madness of this airport, and suddenly he was standing in front of this man. He had no idea why he was doing this, but he was just begging him, get me out of this airport. I know you cannot get me onto this flight. I know you cannot speed it up. I don't need an alternative flight. Just get me to another airport. I need to get out of this airport. The guy, I don't know whether he did some kind of Jedi mind trick that the Aikido guys aren't telling us about, but the guy with the clipboard, who had given nobody else any joy all day, said to Pete, come with me. And he put him on another flight which flew out to some other wretched little regional airport where he sat for more hours and caught another flight, and eventually he ended up in London about 48 hours later on. He had to go to a friend's place. A friend was away. Pete, you can have my spot. Took his key from under the mat on the front door, let himself in, collapses onto the bed, falls asleep. He's asleep for 22 hours. When he wakes up, the phone with the answering machine beside the bed is just flashing. It's like flashing, there's 20 messages there or something. He hadn't heard it, he had been that wiped out. He starts picking up the messages, they're all for him, they're his friends. Pete, where are you? You're not here, we're very worried, Pete, very, very worried about you. And he's just saying, get a life, And these calls just got increasingly frantic as he went through. By about the 9th or 10th call, he just gave up and decided to call one of these people back. It was some old girlfriend from campus. And she screamed on the line when he got on and said, hi, it's me, Pete, what's going on? Big scream. She was round about 15 minutes later on, comes through the door, and in that funny way, she's like both hitting him and trying to hug him at the same time. He's, calm down, what's going on? Just tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you tell us you were back? And so I was tired, hitting. She was hitting with a newspaper. Her state of mind was finally explained when she calmed down and she showed him the newspaper. And the flight he had supposed to have been on had not made it very far out of that airport. It had gone down over the mountains, slammed into the side of one, and there were no survivors. And to this day, Pete is convinced that had he not had that year of brutal training of getting out of himself and then going into it and putting his mind into a completely different place, he would not have launched himself across the floor of that airport. He would not have spoken to that guy in the way he did, and he would not be alive today. And I'm inclined to believe him. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's sing this song now. This song was inspired by my late partner Ruby Hunter, of the Nundiddy peoples of South Australia, the lower Murray River and the Coorong. In Ruby's language, Coorong, where the word Coorong or the place Coorong is taken from, the Nundiddy word Coorong. Coorong means to the river. Noppen means to walk or to go. Nukken means to look or to see. There's another word in this song, Nundiddy word, called Tariki, or Tarikis. That means leg or legs. And the song in the Tarikis is where they huddled around their grandmother's Tarikis, the grandmother's legs, underneath her dress when the welfare came looking for the children. Ruby's spiritual identity is the pelican. It's called Nora. And the Milky Way is a great river. And she has surely gone back as a pelican, as a Nora, to the Milky Way, that great river. So this song just called Noppen Kurong. Don't say goodbye, my child. And always look behind you. To the beautiful white all the things that remind you being free. That remind you of being free. Noppen Kurong. Noppen Kurong. Oh, I sang my song to some children in Meningi. And they feeling so strong. Started coming over me. I was free. Yes, it felt like I was free. Noppen Kurong. Noppen Kurong. My grandmother I can see wrapped around her Tariki, standing safely on the shore underneath the dress she wore. We were hidden secretly from the welfare causes. See, Granny knew they'd taken children many times before. Noppen Kurong. Noppen Kurong. Say goodbye to my pain. These city shadows chill me to the bone. And I'm going back again to that place where they took me from, to my home. Yeah, I feel like going home. Not been to rock, knocking to rock. Go to the river, Ruby. Look to the river.